I talk about Malifaux lore on the internet a lot, and one of the questions that always comes up is, what's my favorite story? What's up, everybody? Jeff here. Welcome back to the channel, and I'm just going to kind of spoil it right off the bat. I don't think I have a really clear, concise answer for what my favorite Malifaux story is. There are a lot that I like for a lot of different reasons. So it's really hard for me to just say this one particular story is my favorite. We have everything from little kind of throwaway tone pieces from Wyrd Chronicles all the way up to epic clashes between rival Neverborn leaders and stories about individual characters and their backstories. There's just so much stuff. And frankly, if you ask me this question any day of the week, you're likely to get a different answer as far as what's my favorite at any given moment. But there's definitely some stories that kind of rise to the top and come to mind often when people ask me this question. So I thought it would be useful to go through 5 of my top picks as far as the stories go. These are kind of the ones that tend to come up in the conversation the most often, and I really like them all for different reasons. So these aren't going to be in any particular order, and again, I don't think I can even commit to this being my definitive top 5, but I think this is a really good place to start. And if you're looking for recommendations on where to dip your toes in on the Malifaux lore, then any one of these will be a great place for you to get going. So obviously there are going to be some spoilers in this video, but I will do my best not to spoil any of the 5 stories that I'm actually going to talk about, but I definitely will be spoiling some things around the characters that are involved in those stories. So just be aware of that. If you want to go in totally clean, then I'll just leave a list at the end and you can check that out and go find the stories for yourself. And I'll also put a list down in the description of all of the stories as well as where you can find them, either in printed form or in audiobook form through Breachside Broadcasts. But let's get into the stories. Now, if you know me, then you probably knew that A Line Drawn Fire was going to come up in this conversation. This story came out at the beginning of 3rd edition, and it's from the Arcanists book, and it's written by Tim Akers. I've actually had the opportunity to interview Tim Akers. He is a very prolific writer in the Malifaux world, as well as outside of the Malifaux world. So definitely go check out that interview if you want to know a little bit more, because we did talk about this story. A Line Drawn in Fire is a favorite of mine for a couple of different reasons. First of all, we get a lot of really good character development between 2 of the sort of rival parties within the Arcanists. After Ramos was out of the picture, the Arcanists kind of split up into 2 factions that were not really getting along with each other. On the one hand, you had the more moderate faction under Tony Ironsides, and these were the people that tended to be like the laborers and the workers who wanted to use political means to make sure that they're securing rights for themselves and the mages, and they weren't really about the sort of militant stuff that Ramos used to get into sometimes. Now, on the other hand, you had Akers, and she was the leader of the real terroristy side of the Arcanists. She liked to go burn things down and attack the guild and was not above getting her hands dirty to get what she wanted. So these 2 groups sort of had a rivalry, and things definitely got to a point where they were just about to turn violent. And behind the scenes, we actually know that Wyrd was considering breaking them out into 2 separate factions, the MNSU on the one side and then the Arcanists on the other side. Now, obviously, they didn't decide to go that direction, and this is sort of the story where we more or less resolve that arc. Now, of course, the 2 women don't sit down for a cup of tea to hash out their differences, and the story basically resolves itself over the course of a very long fight between Ironsides and Akers. And as a writer, I think one of Tim Akers' strong points is definitely writing action scenes that have some sort of plot advancement tied into them and sort of balancing those 2 considerations. So there's lots of really good action, and it's broken up with little bits of conversation and explanations of what's going on behind the scenes. But each element of the story doesn't really take away from the other. They sort of feed into each other, and you really get this sense of the tension building as both of the women are beating themselves up and wearing themselves out and getting exhausted, both mentally and physically. There's a couple of curveballs that come up and some crazy stuff happens, and by the end of the story, we get a much better sense of where both of these women stand and why they're doing the things that they're doing. The Arcanists are a favorite of mine. I think it's one of the more interesting areas of the lore for Malifaux, largely because of the sort of real-world implications and parallels that we can see. And this conversation between the traditional moderate approach to resolving these political problems and the more militant side is always something that I find very interesting. Now, this is a very, very minor spoiler for this story, but one of my favorite little bits that we get throughout this story is that Karis and Ironsides are facing off, and it's sort of the middle of their fight, but they end up in this factory. And they take a minute to allow the normal factory workers to clear out before they continue beating the crap out of each other, because obviously it's going to be dangerous for everybody else. As these factory workers are walking out of the factory, they actually turn to Ironsides and ask her if she needs help. And I think this is a really interesting way to demonstrate the fact that Tony Ironsides is the more popular and the more well-known of the two women. Karis has her little splinter group and they do their terrorist things, but Ironsides has become quite popular even in Ramos's absence, which may be a little bit surprising because Ramos was obviously very popular himself. But it's a really interesting way that we get some insight into what the sort of normal people who live in Malifaux would think about this whole thing. That's a perspective that we don't really get quite as often, so I think it was a really interesting little tidbit to include in this story. Definitely go check out A Line Drawn in Fire. It's one of my favorite stories, both for the structure of the story and how it plays out, but also because of the insight that we get into the two characters and the way that they develop throughout the story. Last Call at the Grey Lord by Graeme Stevenson is a story from the Crossroads expansion from 2nd edition. You may have seen this piece of art, which is kind of a mild spoiler, but the title of the story is kind of a mild spoiler as well. And in it we see Kirai and Molly getting up to some fun shenanigans. Now, these are two characters that I am really fond of, and this story is kind of the reason why that's the case. Kirai was a former prostitute who had a lot of really tragic stuff happen to her. The Governor General was out to get her, accidentally killed her boyfriend, who happened to be the Governor General's son. And then she finds herself under the influence of one of the tyrants and gains all sorts of strange magical powers. Now she's on a quest for vengeance / trying to get her lost love back. And that's where she bumps into Molly. Now, Molly's got her own kind of tragic backstory. She was originally killed by Seamus and then brought back to life and then died again and then brought back to life. And she is an undead who really was pretty clear that she wanted to be let go. She wanted to kind of die all the way. But because of the way that she was risen the second time, she actually found that she was able to maintain her own sense of agency and was able to sort of break away from Seamus and be her own woman again. Now she's sort of the leader of the misfits. She has a little parade of zombies that follow her around, and they're just sort of lost souls who don't know what to do with themselves, so they hang out with Molly and they find her kind of comforting. So you can definitely understand why when she meets somebody like Kirai, she would definitely be intrigued by the woman. Now, the two don't initially hit it off exactly because they're both a little bit socially awkward. They're both very damaged people, but it turns out that they both like wandering through the slums and doing a little bit of vigilante work. And basically the way this story plays out is it's the two gal pals traipsing through the slums and just murdering bad people. We get a couple of little scenes where they see some people doing some bad stuff, and those people get punished quite severely. And the story eventually evolves, and we see a man who is the leader of a sex trafficking ring. He's selling women into prostitution, and they decide that they don't like that very much. It's a really great story because not only do we see these two characters who typically don't have a lot of joy or happiness or positive things going on in their lives really enjoying each other's company in their own ways. They become buddies throughout the course of this story, and the whole time in the background we get Molly tormenting Philip, who is the disembodied head that she hangs around with all the time, by knitting him little outfits, and he's real upset by that. It's a very funny story, but it's also a very dark story because of the subject matter, and honestly, I think that makes it a perfect story for the Malifaux universe, because I think that really sums up Malifaux in a nutshell. I would love to see these characters meet each other again because we don't get a ton of interaction between them after this story. But go check out Last Call at the Grey Lord and let me know what you think of Kirai and Molly. If you're enjoying this video and you want to support the channel, then there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. The first would be to pick up some merchandise through my merch store. You can grab a t-shirt, a hoodie, a mug, a sticker, all sorts of cool stuff like that. You can also shop using my affiliate links, so if you're going to make any purchases from any of these companies, you can use the links in the description below to make your purchases, and it will go directly to supporting the channel at no extra cost to you. There's also a link for my Ko-fi if you would just like to give me a tip, or my Patreon if you want to support me longer term. I have a bunch of different tiers there, and there are all sorts of benefits available to people, such as early access to videos, ad-free videos, the opportunity to vote in polls about upcoming content, and extra entries into the giveaways that I run occasionally. But if none of that is your cup of tea, no problem at all. Just make sure that you're subscribed to the channel and leave a like on the video. It actually helps a tremendous amount. And if you want to go the extra mile, then consider sharing the video out with some friends who you think might find it interesting. The YouTube algorithm is not kind to small YouTubers, so that helps a whole bunch. Other than that, consider joining the Discord, also linked in the description, where you can come and hang out with me and the rest of the community and talk games. But with that, let's get right back to the video. Now, if you ask the wider Malifaux community what their favorite Malifaux story is, you're probably going to hear a couple of answers come up very frequently, and Puzzle Box might be the #1 answer you get. This is a really old Malifaux story. It's actually from Twisting Fates, which is a first edition book, and it's written by David McGuire. I've also interviewed David McGuire on the channel before, so go ahead and check out that video. He has written some real bangers. He brought us people like Damien Ravencroft and English Ivan and all the fan favorite characters like that. So you won't want to miss that interview. It's super interesting. Now, Puzzle Box is where we get introduced to Damien Ravencroft, and this is long before he was a character in the game. But at first, we don't really know who he is. We're introduced to a witchling stalker, and these are sort of the husks of former mages who Sonia Crid has burned out their souls and turned them into little witch hunting puppies, basically. It's a really horrible process. It's one of the really terrible things about Sonia Crid and the things that she gets up to, and it's why I hate her. But it turns out that she is not the most clever person around when it comes to this story. As we see the sort of day-to-day activities that the Witchling Stalker is getting up to, it slowly becomes apparent that more and more of his agency and potentially even memories are coming back to him. Now, I don't want to say much more than that because I don't want to spoil exactly what it is that happens in the story. But if you know who Damien Ravencroft is, then you know that he is no longer a Witchling Stalker. So things take a bit of a positive turn for him. Throughout the story, we get introduced to a bunch of different rogue mages who were being hunted by the witch hunters, and a bunch of them end up being characters in the game many, many, many years later when Damien and his crew get introduced to the game. It's a really fun story, not only because it's sort of a clever way to undermine the witch hunters and Sonia Crid, but also just in the structure of the way that the story is told, because it's sort of a mystery. We don't really understand what's going on at the beginning, and as the character understands more and more about the situation that he's in, the reader also sort of gets clued in on what's going on until we get the reveal at the end. It's a really interesting way to tell a story, and I'm actually told that the audiobook version on the Breachside broadcast is really, really well done as well. I tend not to like the audiobooks. I tend to like to read the stories, but if you like audiobooks, that one has been highly recommended to me. Welcome to Malifaux by Justin Gibbs. This is a story from the Shifting Loyalties expansion in 2nd edition, and the main character of this story is Taylor. Now, this is a really fun story to me because not only does it do a lot to develop the universe of Malifaux and some of the sort of bigger lore for the setting, but it also does a lot to develop the character of Taylor, which is interesting because we don't really get a ton of character development for most non-master characters. Taylor's actually the only character I've done a lore guide episode on so far, and I do intend to do some other ones, but she definitely seems the most significant, and it's largely because of this story. This story actually takes place over the course of a pretty wide range of time, and we get to learn a little bit about the reasons that Taylor came through the breach, what she got up to when she first got here, some things about her backstory, and how she ended up being a mercenary. We also get a little bit of insight into her family life, her relationship with some of the other outcasts, and how she got her relic hammer. Now, if you know a lot about Malifaux lore, then you know that a relic hammer is a pretty big deal because there's not very many of them and they're super powerful. Without spoiling it, the entity that she gets the hammer from is someone who hints at a lot of the larger Malifaux lore and things that might be going on in the story in the future. But frankly, some of the mysteries here still haven't been solved, and hopefully we're going to learn more about that. I can't really say for sure. As is typical for Malifaux characters, her story is quite tragic, and we learn a lot about her and why she does some of the things that she does throughout the course of this story, and it's not great for her. But I find that it's really interesting, and again, it's another story that the structure of the story actually adds a lot to the story that's being told. I think this is one that sort of gets overlooked in the conversation of the best Malifaux story. So if you haven't read it or you haven't read it recently, then I definitely suggest that you go back and check it out. 3 Riddles and a Traitor. This is a story by N.A. Wolf, and it is from the 10 Thunders expansion for 3rd edition Malifaux. Now, this is a story that I don't know that I can think of anyone else who holds this story in as high regard as I do. Now, maybe that just means that I need better friends, but 3 Riddles and a Traitor has a lot to offer, and it is definitely one of my favorites. One of my favorite things to see in any kind of fiction is a subversion of expectations. Something that I think Malifaux is really good for is taking a trope or an archetype for a character and giving you a teeny little bit of that familiarity. They feed you a little bit of what you expect from a character based on who they are or what they look like, but then they make a left turn and do something else with it. And in 3 Riddles and a Traitor, we are introduced to Yuko Hamasaki, who is a very attractive Japanese woman who runs a sake house and is a sort of information broker. Now, a lot of people will tell you that that's a stereotype and that in some ways representing Japanese women in this way, especially if they're only represented in this way, that can be quite harmful. And while I certainly agree, my favorite thing about this story is that we immediately find out that that is not all there is to Yuko's character. Because we soon find out that Yuko is going to play the part that is usually played by an old wise man in Masaki's story and character development. She ends up being the mentor to Masaki and teaching her the right way to approach some of the problems that she's facing in her leadership of the 10 Thunders. Misaki's a really interesting character in and of herself because she is sort of forced into this world of organized crime, and it's clear that she didn't choose this path. She didn't necessarily want to do things this way, so she's diverged from the way that her father led the 10 Thunders, and she takes a much more subtle approach to leadership in the way that she sort of enforces the rules. But she still has a lot of problems, and she still kind of has these instincts that she should use a pretty heavy hand when it comes to dealing with her people. When she encounters Yuko, Yuko outsmarts her in a number of different ways. And again, that's not something that you necessarily expect from a character like her. She's super reluctant to work with the 10 Thunders because she knows what they do and she thinks that they're potentially a threat to her sort of information network. But she gives Masaki some information, and it turns out that it's sort of a test to see what Masaki will do with that information. It turns out that Masaki has some beef with one of her agents, namely Mei Fang, and she goes to confront her, and the two have a huge fight. We get into a lot of the politics that are going on within the 10 Thunders and in the wider world of Malifaux, and when Masaki goes back to Yuko, Yuko's very impressed by how she handled the situation with Mei Fang. She more or less decides to work as a consultant for the 10 Thunders, and you get the idea that she becomes Masaki's mentor, which is funny because that's sort of the role that Minako Rei was playing up until this point. Now, again, I think that stereotypes are a harmful thing, but I do think that this story does a lot to subvert the stereotypes that we are presented with. This is a story about 3 women primarily. You have Masaki, you have Mei Fang, and you have Yuko, and each one of them plays a role that you do not traditionally associate with women or particularly Asian women when it comes to stereotypical storytelling. We get a lot of character development for Masaki, who is one of my favorite characters, but we also get some development in her relationship with Mei Fang and what Mei Fang is up to and what her goals are. And we see a lot of behind the scenes of Yuko and what her role is in this organization and in the world of Malifaux. Yuko's a really interesting character to me. I really like her portrayal in this story, and I think that there's a lot of really clever writing in here. Particularly all of the scenes between Masaki and Yuko and their interactions with each other. I think it's super, super well done, and I think it's a really interesting way to show some of Masaki's weaknesses and the ways that she can try to overcome them. So that's 5 of my favorite Malifaux stories, and obviously this is heavily, heavily subjective because these are just the 5 stories that came to mind when I think of what my favorite stories are. So your opinions might vary. You might notice a couple of key themes between these stories. I think all but one of them would pass the Bechdel test with flying colors, which is definitely something that I think appeals to me, and I think it's something that is very unique to Malifaux. If you don't know what the Bechdel test is, then go look up the Bechdel test. You should know what the Bechdel test is. I also think that all of these stories really heavily highlight individual characters and their journeys or story arcs, and the ways that they sort of change and develop over the course of the story. None of these stories really move the state of the world of Malifaux. There's not really grand scale changes happening in terms of any of the factions or the tyrants or anything along those lines. But these are some really, really important stories for the individual characters and their growth. On top of that, I think a lot of these stories have a really interesting style of storytelling in terms of the structure of the stories. Whether it's a line drawn in fire's use of the combat to advance the story between the two fighters, puzzle boxes sort of revealing the mystery over time as the character themselves is understanding the mystery, or Welcome to Malifaux, where the story is told through a series of flashbacks that cover a pretty wide range of time in Malifaux. I think it's also no coincidence that all of these authors are some of the more prominent within the Malifaux catalog, so if you like any of these stories, I would definitely encourage you to go seek out some more written by them. Now, there's a lot of other really good stories in Malifaux, so I'm just going to leave a list here of other standouts and favorites of mine, so that if you just want to jump around and read a whole bunch of different good stuff, you can go ahead and do that. Get down in the comments and let me know what you think of my list of 5, and post your own list, because I'm always curious to see what other people especially like when it comes to Malifaux stories. With that, I want to send a huge thank you to the extremely cool kids here on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Rob Younts, Tom Likely, and Russets, and thanks for watching.